The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were on the judge, a stern figure with a reputation for being unyielding, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the young man standing before him. The teenager, barely 18, looked out of place in his oversized suit, his hands nervously fidgeting with the cuffs. He was black, and in this courtroom, that seemed to be enough for the judge to make up his mind before the trial even began. "Do you even understand the gravity of the charges against you?" the judge sneered, his tone laced with mockery. The teenager hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, and for a moment it seemed like he was just another kid caught in a system that had already written him off. But then, something shifted. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, and when he spoke his voice was calm, measured, and carried a weight that no one expected. "Your Honor," he began, "with all due respect, I believe it's you who doesn't understand the gravity of this situation." The room froze. Who was this kid? And why did it suddenly feel like the tables were about to turn in the most unexpected way? This wasn't just any teenager. His name was Jamal Carter, and he had spent his entire life being underestimated. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, he had learned early on that the world would judge him by the color of his skin, long before it ever considered the content of his character. But Jamal wasn't like most kids. While others were out playing basketball or hanging out on street corners, he was buried in books, studying law, philosophy, and anything else he could get his hands on. He had a dream, one that seemed impossible for someone like him, to become an attorney, not just any attorney, but one who could fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And now, here he was, standing in a courtroom that reeked of privilege and prejudice, about to show everyone that genius doesn't always come in the package you expect. The judge, a man named Harold Grayson, was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper biases. He had seen countless young black men like Jamal come through his courtroom, and he had long since stopped seeing them as individuals. To him, they were all the same, troublemakers, delinquents, a burden on the system. But Jamal was different, and the more he spoke, the more it became clear that this wasn't going to be the open and shut case Grayson had anticipated. "Your Honor," Jamal continued, his voice steady, "I've reviewed the evidence, and I can assure you there are inconsistencies that need to be addressed. If you'll allow me, I'd like to present my findings." The judge's eyebrows shot up, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Who did this kid think he was? But before Grayson could shut him down, Jamal pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase, neatly organized and annotated with precision. It was clear that this wasn't some last-minute attempt to save himself. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As Jamal began to lay out his case, the tension in the room grew thicker. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Linda Harper, exchanged a glance with the judge. They had both expected this to be an easy win, but now they weren't so sure. Jamal's arguments were sharp, his logic impeccable, and his knowledge of the law was unsettling. It was as if he had been preparing for this moment his entire life, and in a way, he had. What no one in that courtroom knew was that Jamal wasn't just a teenager fighting a charge. He was a prodigy, a legal savant who had been quietly studying the intricacies of the justice system for years. He had even passed the bar exam in secret, a fact that only a handful of people knew. But he had never practiced, never taken on a case, until now. The judge leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. "Young man," he said slowly, "where did you learn all this?" Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. "I taught myself, Your Honor. I didn't have the privilege, fancy schools or expensive tutors. But I had a dream, and I wasn't going to let anyone tell me I couldn't achieve it." For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in Grayson's eyes. He had spent decades on the bench, confident in his authority, but this kid was challenging everything he thought he knew. And then, just as Jamal was about to deliver the final blow, the judge raised his hand, cutting him off. "Enough," Grayson said, his voice tight. I've heard enough. We'll reconvene tomorrow." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, the moment was over. But the damage had been done. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers, and Jamal could feel the weight of their stares as he gathered his things. He had shaken the foundation of the system, if only for a moment. But tomorrow was another day, and he knew the fight was far from over. As Jamal walked out of the courtroom, his mind raced. He had done what he set out to do. He had made them see him. Really see him. But he also knew that the judge wasn't going to let this go easily. Grayson had a reputation to uphold, and Jamal had just threatened to tear it all down. What would happen tomorrow? Would the judge dismiss the case, or would he double down, determined to put Jamal in his place? And what about the prosecutor? Linda Harper wasn't someone who liked to lose, and she had the resources to make Jamal's life a living hell if she wanted to. But Jamal wasn't afraid. He had spent his entire life fighting against the odds, and he wasn't about to stop. Now, as he stepped out into the sunlight, he allowed himself a small smile. The game was far from over, and he was just getting started. But for now, the question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. What would happen when the gavel fell? Tomorrow? The sun was setting as Jamal walked down the courthouse steps, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. He could still feel the judge's eyes on him, that mix of disbelief and irritation burning into his back. But he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Every step he took was a step closer to the life he had fought so hard to build. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. As he turned the corner, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his older sister, Keisha. "How'd it go?" He paused, his fingers hovering over the screen. How could he even begin to explain what had just happened? Instead, he typed back a simple, "It's not over yet." Keisha would understand. She always did. Keisha had been his rock ever since their parents passed away. She was the one who had worked double shifts to keep a roof over their heads. The one who had encouraged him to keep studying even when it felt like the world was against him. She believed in him when no one else did, and that belief had carried him through some of his darkest moments. But even she didn't know the full extent of what he had been working on. Jamal had kept his plans close to the chest, not out of distrust, but out of fear. Fear that if he told anyone, they would try to talk him out of it. Fear that if he failed, he would let down the one person who had always stood by him. But now, with the trial hanging in the balance, he wondered if he should have told her sooner. If nothing else, she deserved to know what he was up against. As Jamal made his way to the bus stop, his mind drifted back to the courtroom. The judge's reaction had been telling. Grayson wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Jamal. And that was the problem. To Grayson, Jamal was just another statistic, another black kid caught up in the system. But Jamal was determined to prove him wrong. He had spent years studying the law, not just to understand it, but to master it. He had read every case file he could get his hands on, memorized every precedent, and practiced every argument until it was second nature. He had even reached out to a few attorneys in the area, offering to work for free just to get a foot in the door. Most of them had turned him down, but one, a retired public defender named Mr. Thompson, had taken him under his wing. It was Mr. Thompson who had encouraged him to take the bar exam, who had told him that he had what it took to be a great attorney. And now, here he was, putting that belief to the test. But Jamal knew it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about proving something bigger. It was about showing the world that talent and intelligence didn't have a color, that someone like him could rise above the stereotypes and make a difference. And he wasn't alone. There were others out there, kids just like him, who had been told they would never amount to anything. Kids who had been written off before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Jamal wanted to be proof that they could succeed, that they could defy the odds and come out on top. But first, he had to get through this trial. The bus ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to his thoughts. When he finally reached his stop, he was greeted by the familiar sight of his neighborhood. It wasn't much, just A row of modest houses and a few corner stores, but it was home. As he walked down the street, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball in the park. They were laughing, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. And for a moment, Jamal allowed himself to smile. They were just kids, innocent and full of potential. But he couldn't help but wonder how many of them would end up in a courtroom, like the one he had just left. How many of them would be given the same chances he had? The thought weighed heavily on him as he approached his house. Inside, Keisha was waiting for him. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, her face etched with concern. "So?" she asked as soon as he walked in. Jamal sighed, dropping his bag by the door and sinking into a chair across from her. "It's complicated," he said, running a hand over his face. Keisha raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" Jamal hesitated, then decided to tell her everything. He started with the judge's reaction, the way Grayson had mocked him at first, only to be caught off guard by his knowledge of the law. He told her about the prosecutor, Linda Harper, and how she had seemed almost amused by the whole thing, as if she didn't see him as a real threat. And then he told her about the case itself, the charges that had been brought against him, and how he had spent weeks preparing his defense. Keisha listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Jamal finally finished, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "So let me get this straight," she said slowly. "You're representing yourself in a case that could land you in jail, and you didn't think to tell me?" Jamal winced. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. Keisha shook her head. "Jamal, you're my brother. It's my job to worry about you. But more than that, I want to help you. You don't have to do this alone." Jamal looked down at his hands, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long trying to protect her, to shield her from the weight of his struggles, that he had forgotten how much she wanted to be there for him. "I know," he said quietly. I didn't want to let you down." Keisha reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You could never let me down," she said firmly. "But you have to let me in. We're a team, remember?" Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel so alone. But even as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of his sister's support, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. The judge had adjourned the trial, but Jamal knew that Grayson wasn't going to let him off easy. And then there was Linda Harper. She was a seasoned attorney, and Jamal had no doubt that she was already planning her next move. He had managed to catch them off guard today, but tomorrow would be a different story. As the night wore on, Jamal found himself poring over his notes, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he had to be prepared for anything, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. And as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet of the night, he made a promise to himself. No matter what happened, he was going to fight. Not just for himself, but for all of them. The question was, would it be enough?